The title of my presentation is The Complexity of Genocide Trauma Across Generations. As we know, across millennia, human beings have experienced two major kinds of traumas, disasters that have led to trauma. Natural disasters and man-made disasters. Natural disasters are experiences such as major earthquakes, major, let's say, fires that a person can be caught in. And man-made disasters are examples of that would be wars and rapes and genocides. And you heard a few examples of the expressions of the survivors of the genocide talking about rape. That is a man-made disaster that leads to trauma. By definition, trauma caused by major disasters, especially man-made disasters, are extremely complex, very traumatizing. They exhibit themselves in a variety of symptoms. They're debilitating. They're diagnosable. They can be treated with some success. And because of treatment, life can become more manageable and return to a certain level of normalcy, but they're extremely devastating. Transition of trauma from the parent generation to the offspring generations have been studied in a variety of different fields. As I said before, they have been studied in psychology, sociology, psychiatry, and a new field called epigenetics, and I will refer to it. I am not a biological scientist, I'm a behavioral scientist, but I will highlight the fact that a new and up-and-coming field called epigenetics is evolving as we speak, and we are looking into the genetic inheritance of trauma. Now, my presentation today is based on a very rich body of data. I have drawn from qualitative and quantitative studies. I have drawn from the oral accounts of survivors of the Armenian genocide. I have drawn from the Holocaust survivor stories and studies and their second and third generations. And I have also looked at some animal studies. Now, I will be talking about two major groups. I will be talking about the survivors of the genocide and the following generations. As far as the survivors are concerned, I'm going to talk about the nature of the trauma, response, their response to trauma, diagnostic frameworks that I have looked at, and I have tried to place their trauma in those diagnostic frameworks, characteristics of survivors in general, and long-term impact of the trauma on the survivors. And then I will talk about the following generation, and in that segment of my presentation, I will look at vicarious trauma, and I will define that for you. The second and third generation response to trauma and the utility of healing. Now, I'm not going, the first section of the conference was devoted to a very moving, emotionally moving presentation by Dr. Garabedian, and you saw the emotionality of it, and I'm sure you felt it as well. What I'm going to do is to run through all of the sufferings, some of the sufferings that the survivors were exposed to. Not because I don't want to give it enough time, but because I want to take the emotionality away from my presentation. You were already triggered. So I'm going to become very abstract in running through these traumas, and I'm going to then categorize them. They are basically psychological, physical, and moral in nature, these traumas. You know that most of these survivors and their families were asked to pack and leave within hours. They had no prior notice as to the fact that they were moving. They didn't know where they were going, why they were going, where they were going, and had no idea as to what was happening to them. They had no, they were traveling on foot, There were no modes of transportation. They were leaderless. Their leaders were taken away. Men were gone. Women, children, and the elderly were left behind. They were exposed to hunger, thirst, shelter, and safety. These are basic needs for survival of human beings. Loss of clothing, you heard about. Bleeding feet, exposed bones, rapes, beatings, murders, horrifying sights to witness, snatching of children, girls, forcible marriages, taking people to slavery, tragic decisions, and we heard about those decisions, merciful, altruistic killings, homicides, abandoning children, tired and the sick because they could no longer continue with the caravans, sacrificing one child to hang on to the rest of the children, in a mother's case, voluntary marriages with the perpetrators seemingly wanting to protect the rest of the families, feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, hysteria. Now, I have to quickly add that major traumas have been known across millennia. If you go to Homer's Iliad, you will read about what happened to the Trojan War veterans and their feelings. We hear about soldiers' heart in the context of the Civil War. We hear about railroad spine. These are the accounts of those who were engaged in the building of the railroad system during the 19th century in Europe. We hear about shell shock, battle fatigue, Vietnam syndrome, stress response syndrome, and then finally you may remember that, some of you may remember, some of you may not, that during the Gulf War, there was a lot of discussion in media as to what was happening to the soldiers, and they were coming back and they were exhibiting a syndrome that they couldn't put their finger on. And at that point, I was at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences Medical School, and we were looking at these soldiers and as they were coming back, and there was something happening. There was no other diagnosis that could be applied to these people, and then the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, came about. And that diagnosis was included in the DSM-3, which DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is and was used by psychologists and psychiatrists in diagnosing a particular syndrome or a particular symptom. So at that point, we named it. It's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And in the PTSD diagnosis, what they're saying is that direct trauma is a trauma that a person experiences as a result of enduring the violence and harm from one human being to another, or from another accident, or witnessing violence and harm happening. You know, you may be in an automobile accident and you may have this the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, for a while. But then DSM also talks about vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is the trauma that a person sustains as a result of learning of violence to others, and in this case, or repeated details of it. And I want to submit to you that I'm going to talk about direct and vicarious trauma as they apply to the survivors and the following generations. The diagnostic criteria for PTSD are as follows: intrusive symptoms, avoidance behaviors, alterations in cognitions, and hyperarousal. And Carla alluded to this, referring back to the accounts of the survivors. Intrusive symptoms in the forms of preoccupation with the experience of genocide applied to those who survived. Flashbacks of suffering, recurrent nightmares and thoughts. They could not get rid of those nightmares and thoughts. avoidance behavior in survivors of the genocide that come out of their stories. These refer to the emotional exhaustion that they experienced. They avoided sometimes sharing of their stories. They could not talk about it. There was total silence. And some of the offsprings of the survivors complained that this was an issue for them. They had no idea what was happening, what had happened to their parents. And they were sometimes even angry about it. But the silence was prevalent in a very large group of survivors. They could not attend ceremonies referring to the genocide. They could not give interviews, and they avoided people, locations, and objects that reminded them of the experiences that they endured. Negative alterations in cognitions and mood in the form of lack of ability to remember some aspects of the experiences that they endured. Again, Carla referred to shame, blame, and guilt. Fearfulness, sometimes detachment, burning, and overwhelming anger and rage was prevalent. And this, oftentimes, you will hear in the accounts of the survivors, this was an anger and rage over loss of childhood, loss of happiness, and loss of belonging. Hyperarousal was also exhibited by these people in the forms of sleep disturbances, crying spells, self-destructive behaviors, hypervigilance, and suspiciousness. Some of you might have experienced this coming from your grandparents. Where are you going? Who are you with? Don't do this. You are not modest enough. You are not looking modest enough. You know, cover yourself. Who is this person? What do you know about them? These are hypervigilance and suspiciousness that was exhibited by the survivors of the genocide. Okay, I told you about the criteria. You heard and you looked at pictures and accounts of the survivors. And those of you who have done extensive study of the survivors know that the PTSD diagnosis does apply. We know that. However, it seems as if the PTSD diagnosis is not enough. Somehow one feels like there's got to be another diagnosis that can be applied to this. PTSD is not enough. But then there's another thought, and that was, okay, they survived. They somehow got away. They somehow stayed alive. But how could they actually live on? How could they survive? How could they go on? Who were these people? What skills did they have? And under what circumstances could they endure this kind of trauma, this kind of pain? Now, reading through a lot of literature, and I have to refer you to the books and papers that have been produced by many, including the Millers, and you will have the opportunity of meeting them. And one of our other speakers, Dr. Haas, as well as Dr. Rubina Pirumian, who has several books on this issue. One knows, somehow comes to understand that these survivors were really emotionally and physically very strong to have endured that pain, to have endured that challenge that they're talking about. They were perhaps even more skillful than average people, more resourceful, perhaps even a little more intelligent in knowing how to conduct themselves or manage themselves. I'm not saying that those who perished were not skillful, strong, intelligent, or extraordinary. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that given those circumstances, perhaps those who survived did something or were probably in a situation that was more favorable for survival. Maybe they used some adaptive reactions, such as avoiding dwelling on the tragedy, meeting basic needs, and leaving the rest of it alone, conducting in some altruistic exercises, and even emotional numbness sometimes can be an adaptive measure when you are exposed to extreme trauma. This is my declaration. I would like to submit to you that perhaps these people were resilient, more resilient, hardy, skillful, and adaptable than your average person. Research on survivors under extreme duress indicates that extreme duress causes extreme exhaustion. And immediately after the experience, the person has to be supported in a certain way to be able to move on. They have to have enough food, they have to have shelter, enough safety, and a lot of social support to be able to move on, to be able to go on. Many of the people who survived the genocide were children, and many of them ended up in orphanages. Again, reading about these orphanages and the conditions there, they weren't all the same. There were varied conditions across these orphanages. But all in all, they provided food, shelter, and some safety. We know that some of these orphanages had to sometimes move from one location to the other to provide safety, etc. But all in all, they provided the basics. However, again, reading about these orphanages, one comes to understand that there was a lot of social support that they offered to these orphans. The orphans felt as if they were amongst their own. Everybody was the same. Even the caretakers and the teachers were coming from the same kinds of backgrounds. They experienced their culture in those little groups that they were in. They had some education. They received some vocational training, and they were protected until they came of age and had to move on. So they did receive a significant amount of social support as infants. Again, drawing from the Miller and Turian work, and this is their 1993 book, I would like to highlight the fact that the PTSD that we think that we can apply to the survivors was a lifelong diagnosis. Because we know that across their life, they had the feelings of avoidance and repression, outrage, anger, feelings of revenge and restitution. Two sides of revenge. Do we take revenge? What is restitution is about? What is reconciliation? How does it vary from forgiveness, resignation, despair, explanation, retaliation? All of these feelings, all of these constructs, all of these ideas floated through their minds and through their beings across their lifespans. Now, I finished my talk about the survivors. Now let's move on to the next generation. Can trauma be transmitted? Can it go from one generation to the next? Do you have to hear stories from your parent generation for the trauma to transfer to you? What happened in cases where there was total, absolute silence in the parent generation and they could not articulate what happened to them and what they were going through? So is it through stories, or are there other mechanisms that can be referred to, can be used to explain what happened to the second generation, to the next generation? Well, we know that vicarious trauma, according to the PTSD definition, is trauma that a person sustains as a result of learning of violence to another person, to a parent, to someone even someone they don't know. and with whom they may be empathically engaged. So we know that hearing stories, even stories about people who are not related to you, can be traumatic. And that's called vicarious trauma. So the second generation that came after, the next generation that came after the survivors, did have some stories, and that they did have vicarious trauma. So the PTSD diagnosis does apply to the second generation. However, I want to submit to you that a new field, the field of epigenetics, that is evolving as we speak, that has a very short history of 10 to 12 years, is saying that there's more to this. There's more to hearing, to being trauma has another story that we all need to be cognizant of. I am not a biological scientist. I am a behavioral scientist, and I cannot even begin to tell you in any level of detail what epigenetics is. All I want to say is that epigenetics offers an explanation of how trauma-induced changes can be transmitted from the parent to offspring generation. It's the study of heritable changes in gene activity that are not due to changes in DNA sequence. What we're saying here is that trauma leads to biophysical changes in the survivor. Sometimes those biochemical changes are such that the activity of certain genes turn on and stay on. For example, the gene or gene group responsible for depression may turn on and stay on. And these biophysiological changes do transfer to the next generation. I have looked at the work of Rachel Yehuda of Sinai Hospital in New York. I have spoken with Dr. Rosa Selimian of Hopkins University, who teaches epigenetics there, trying to understand and verify the fact that this genetic inheritance of trauma is a real thing. And Rosa assured me that that is the case, and I have read and reread Yehuda's information and articles, etc., trying to come up here, stand before you, and say, yes, trauma can be inherited. And there are studies, human studies, and in fact animal studies too, that corroborate this particular statement that I just made. There are human studies, for example, I have looked at studies of Holocaust survivors who have PTSD diagnosis with low cortisol levels. Their offsprings also have low cortisol levels. Children of survivors of wars, children or war veterans, exhibit the same kind of change in their biophysiological changes as their parent generation did. I looked at studies coming from the 9/11. There was a group of pregnant women who were caught in the 9/11 disaster, who then later developed PTSD. Their newborn babies also had low levels of cortisol as the moms did. And as I said, the animal studies also corroborate this particular statement that I made, that trauma can be transferred from one generation to the other. I found this diagram. I looked at many different diagrams, and I chose this one to try to simply show you that what I'm understanding from epigenetics is that sometimes extreme trauma turns on certain genes in the body, certain genes in the chromosome, and they stay on. They don't turn off, they stay on. And that's thus the genetic transmission of trauma from one generation to the other. Again, I'm not a geneticist. I am just highlighting the fact that this particular scientific area is evolving, and this is what they're saying. There was, in the last issue of the Science magazine, there was an article, the November 6th Science magazine, said, by McCary, says that the effect to which your parent or grandparents were exposed, even if not directly mutagenic, may alter your phenotype or that of your children or grandchildren. Now let's talk about the offspring response to what happened to the parent generation. Profound loss, sense of loss, difficult decisions that they were faced with, difficult responsibilities, recurrence of trauma, and prolonged anger. As I mentioned to you, Dr. Rubina Perumian's new book that just came out last month, The Armenian Genocide in Literature, sort of backs up whatever it is that I'm going to say next. Profound sense of loss. Loss of 1.5 million of your own. Loss of homeland, monuments, relics, community, leadership in your community, legacy, family property, wealth, home, and I have highlighted potential. And I think Dr. Garabedian referred to this concept too. Potential. The next generation, the generation that came after the survivors, realized, they knew. It wasn't something that anyone had to tell them. They came from a base of poverty. Their parents were orphans. They were poorly educated. They had the potential of building on what they had, but that was taken away. Their parents were in transition for a lifetime, from community to community, from culture to culture, trying to learn one language and had to move on. And this reduces your base of power. They were faced with difficult decisions of revenge versus forgiveness versus reconciliation, forgetting versus remembering, restitution, reparation. These are concepts that we just continuously are grappling with. What do I do? Do I remember? It's very painful. Do I forget? How can I forget? Those kinds of emotions. Recurrence of trauma is a real issue. Every April 24th, every book you read on genocide, every conversation about Turkey or the genocide, every denial, every act of denial by Turkey, every aggressive act, every offensive reversal of facts, reversal of history, every tour book about Turkey, every report on Turkey triggers something. Recurrence of trauma. Profound anger is something that the next generations have experienced in a major way due to multifaceted loss, continuous denial, feelings of helplessness, and feelings of lack of clarity about where we should be moving as a group who has endured a particular very traumatic disaster. Anger is an emotional response, and it is an intense emotional response. It is oftentimes as a result of violation of basic boundaries, as you can appreciate. It's a primary and mature response to threat, and it does have its functional value. However, prolonged anger, on the other hand, reduces both personal and collective well-being, productivity, and effectiveness. This is a real issue. And there are important considerations. Recognition and denial constructs, okay? Whose recognition? Whose denial? What are we looking for? How many times do we need to have recognition? By whom? Who should recognize us before we feel as if that issue is taken care of. What is the purpose of recognition, or why is it that denial throws us off every time? And what is it that people's recognition, nations' recognition is going to do for us? Is it a validation? Is it important for healing? Is it something that we need for reparation? What is it? There has to be some clarity. And once we achieve that clarity, I think we will be headed towards probably a better, I guess, a station in love in terms of therapy, in terms of healing from this wound. We need to have very, informed and lucid and clear dialogue about the utility and limitations of anger, utility of healing, necessity of empowered action, actually a definition, an operational definition of empowerment. What is it that we have to do to feel powerful and to feel that we can move forward from the pain? I would like to say thank you to you for your attention. This was my part in this conference. I'm not going to be dealing with healing because there are going to be people who are going to deal with that. We have people who will deal with different levels of healing. People who will address, I guess I should not even go on because I will then be walking into their talks, which I'm not prepared to do so, nor should I be in the position of doing that. But what I'm saying here is that I have tried to present to you the analytic perspective of the trauma that was endured by the survivor generation and that was passed on to the next generation. So now from this point on, we have to hear about what is it that we have to do to take the path of healing and empowerment. Thank you for your attention.